You probably think that the final stand always ends with the death of the great hero, right? A tragic, complex situation. Well, what if I told you that the best way to die isn't tragic? Comment 777 now. Subscribe and start the story. What if your final battle was so perfect, so tactically flawless, that those who defeated you be forced to teach it to their own soldiers forever? Forget the sad ending. This is the story of the final battle that became required reading at the world's toughest military academy. We're going to talk about the crossing of Varys. It's not a moment of glorious victory. It's a moment of devastating defeat. But in that defeat, something happened that military strategists still can't explain without calling it genius. This was a battle to win a war. It was a battle to buy time, and the man at the center of it, the chosen one, who will call Chaol, turn minutes into months, and turn his own grave into a textbook. This is a last stand that wasn't about surviving, but about perfection. The challenge, the unwinnable clock. The problem Chaol faced was simple and impossible. He was at the end of his rope. His rope was the last defense of a tired, shattered kingdom. His enemies, the Iron Legion, were overwhelming. Think of them as a tsunami, countless, highly organized, and utterly relentless. Chaol's side had numbers that were pathetic, maybe 300 loyal fighters, and supplies that were running out. They were holed up in an old, abandoned fortress called Varys Crossing, a place nobody had ever thought to defend because it was so remote and unimportant. The true, deep challenge wasn't the enemy numbers. It was the clock. Chaol didn't need to win the fight. He needed to give the few remaining people, the scholars, the healers, the actual future of his kingdom, a chance to escape across the sea. He needed 48 hours, not a minute less. If the Iron Legion broke through before that time, everything would be lost. Chaol knew deep down that he and his 300 were going to die. That was settled. The question was, could they spend their lives well enough to ensure the kingdom's mind and soul made it to safety? This is what made his challenge so great. It wasn't about hope. It was about execution. He had to plan a flawless defensive operation where the only expected outcome for the defenders was death. Yet the strategic outcome had to be absolute success. The Iron Legion, led by General Valerius, was predictable in their cruelty and speed. They never wasted time. They never took prisoners. They attacked hard, fast, and constantly. Valerius expected to wipe out Chaol's pathetic force in maybe 6 to 8 hours maximum. The challenge was making Valerius lose his greatest weapon, time. Chaol had to make a swift, easy kill turn into a slow, expensive trap, hour by hour, without appearing to be clever, which would only make Valerius more cautious. This is a stage. 300 against tens of thousands, fighting for 2 days of borrowed time, in a location no one cared about. The setup, turning a flaw into a fortress. Chaol's first move was brilliant because it was so counterintuitive. Varys Crossing was a ruined stone structure on a narrow land bridge between two impassable marshlands. Its weakness was its wide-open front gate and its crumbled walls. Most defenders would try to patch the walls and block the gate. Chaol did the opposite. He ordered his men to tear down more walls. Not randomly, but strategically. He widened the gaps in the front and collapsed the interior walls. This looked insane. It looked like he was giving the enemy a free path in. But here is the psychology behind it. Valerius's army was trained to breach a strong defense. They were conditioned to expect barricades, boiling oil, and tightly defended choke points. By creating massive, inviting gaps, Chaol made Valerius question the defense. Valerius would think, this is too easy. It must be a trap. And that doubt, that psychological stop, bought Chaol his first critical 4 hours. Inside the ruins, Chaol set up what is now called a maze of broken sight. He used the rubble from the collapsed walls to create low, chest-high piles and winding paths. These piles were not obstacles. They were visual blockers. The Iron Legion fought best in formation, using long, organized lines. The rubble maze made it impossible to form a line longer than 2 men. Every 10 feet, the field of vision changed. This forced the enemy to break formation, fight as individuals, and most importantly, it slowed their massive attack to a trickle of confused skirmishers. The logistics of death, conserving life and ammo, To last 48 hours with limited resources, Cale introduced two rules that were almost unheard of in that war. The single-shot rule: no archer could fire more than one arrow at a time unless absolutely necessary. Every target had to be confirmed, and every shot had to take a life. They weren't fighting to kill many. They were fighting to discourage many. 100 precise shots that kill 100 commanders are better than 1,000 random shots that kill 1,000 regular soldiers. The emphasis was on taking down anyone who appeared to be giving orders, maximizing the chaos in the Iron Legion's ranks. The retreat tactic: the shell game Cale divided his 300 men into 3 rotating companies: Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. When Alpha Company, defending a specific wall section, reached 50% fatigue, not casualties but tiredness, they didn't fight to the death. They retreated into the maze of rubble, taking hidden paths to the rear. Gamma Company, who had been resting and tending to light wounds, immediately moved to fill the gap. This wasn't a standard reserve. It was a programmed retreat and replacement. This shell game was a secret to lasting 48 hours. The Iron Legion would spend 2 hours fighting Alpha, thinking they were finally weakening the defense. Then, suddenly, they would be fighting Gamma, fresh, rested, and ready for a hard, brutal hour of fighting. Valerius's reports constantly stated, "The defenders are inexhaustible. We are unable to measure their true strength." This simple rotation shattered the enemy's moral and tactical measurement. The first night, water, fire, and the swamp. Valerius, frustrated by the lack of progress, ordered a night assault. This was his biggest mistake, and Cale knew he would make it. The Iron Legion hated fighting at night in terrain they didn't know. Cale's men didn't fight back hard in the darkness. Instead, they focused on 2 things: the mud traps. Knowing the marshland was soft, Cale had his men dig shallow ditches. Not deep enough to drown in, but deep enough to stick a boot in. These ditches were covered with thin layers of straw and mud. The Iron Legion's heavy formations, charging blindly in the dark, constantly broke their lines as men tripped, twisted ankles, and got stuck. The ditches weren't deadly. They were momentum killers. The smoke screen. Cale orders men to light dozens of small, scattered fires using damp wood and marsh grass. The fires didn't provide light. They created a low, thick, acrid smoke that clung to the ground. This smoke was the perfect defense. It blinded the Iron Legion's archers and horses, made the air hard to breathe, and turned a maze of rubble into a truly terrifying, invisible death trap. Cale's men, having spent days memorizing the internal paths, were the only ones who could move efficiently. The first night was a massacre for the Iron Legion, not because of Cale's strength, but because of their own confusion. By dawn, Valerius had lost over 1,000 men and gained less than 20 yards. The most impactful result was that Valerius paused. He pulled back his entire army and spent the entire morning restructuring. Cale had just bought another 6 hours, simply by making the cost of moving forward too high. The mid-game psychology, the art of the near miss. Cale understood that terror is a resource that can be spent, but morale is a renewable resource. He needed to keep his men fighting without hope. He did this with the ritual of the last name. Every time a defender fell, Cale or one of his commanders would shout the fallen man's name. It wasn't a mournful shout. It was a loud, clear declaration, often followed by a brief, simple praise. "Rest, Aruz. The sea is open, or we fight for your time, Jessa. Hold the line." This served 3 purposes. Morale. It honored the fallen instantly and reminded the survivors exactly what they were fighting for: the safety of their kingdom's future, represented by the time they were buying. Control. It gave the enemy a clear, audible count of casualties, which seemed to contradict Valerius's reports that the defenders were inexhaustible. This subtle truth made the Iron Legion commanders trust their leader even less. The legend. Cale was creating his own story in real time. He was demonstrating that his men were dying not in a confused rout, but as part of calm, organized, almost religious sacrifice. This terrified the Iron Legion, who fought only for gold and conquest, not for an idea. By the end of the first day, the battle was less about fighting and more about a duel of wills between Cale and Valerius. Valerius's greatest fear wasn't Cale's skill. It was the meaning Cale was giving to the loss of life. The 48th hour, the final act of deception. The second day dragged on, a slow, grinding meat grinder for both sides. Kale's 300 were down to about 50. He had successfully stalled a legion for 47 hours. The refugees were now far across the sea, safe. Kale had succeeded in his main objective. Now came the final, perfect stand. Valerius, enraged and humiliated by the delay, ordered a final, all-out assault just as the 48th hour was beginning. He threw his remaining forces, expecting to find 50 exhausted, panicked men. But Kale had saved his greatest trick for this exact moment. He gathered his 50 remaining fighters, not at the weakest point of the defense, but at the strongest remaining tower, a small stone keep at the center of the ruins. As the Iron Legion charged, they expected a desperate, screaming final fight. Instead, they met silence. The remaining 50 men were not firing arrows or throwing rocks. They were standing in a tight circle around Kale, perfectly silent, their eyes closed. They had placed all their shields around the perimeter of the tower, making it look like a final, unbreachable wall. The Legion was forced to climb over the shields, fighting through the small, remaining gaps. As the first Legion soldiers reached the top of the shield wall and looked inside, they saw the scene. Kale and his men, quiet, waiting. And then, Kale simply opened his eyes and gave an order. But it wasn't a command to fight. It was an order to ignite. Kale and his men were standing on a massive pile of damp wood, oil, and the bodies of their own fallen comrades. Not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. They were a pyre. The soldiers of the Iron Legion watched in horror as Kale's men drew out small, pre-lit torches and placed them on the ground. A roar of flame erupted around them. Fueled by everything they had gathered, the Chosen One and his remaining loyalists chose to burn their own position to the ground rather than allow the enemy the satisfaction of claiming the kill. This was a perfection of the last stand. Denial of victory. Valerius could not claim a decisive final victory. The enemy was gone, consumed by fire, and the entire battlefield was now a useless, scorched ruin. He took the territory, but he didn't defeat the idea. The psychological scar. The sight of 50 calm, silent men choosing fire over defeat shattered the morale of the Iron Legion. It was a spectacle of conviction that none of them had ever witnessed. It turned Kale from a man into a martyr in the eyes of his own people, and a ghost in the minds of his enemy. The ultimate time buy. The resulting fire was so intense and the structure so ruined that Valerius had to keep his entire army on site for 3 more days, ensuring the area was clear and the fire wouldn't spread to the surrounding marsh, a major logistics concern. Those 3 days were the final, ultimate gift to the fleeing refugees, ensuring they were utterly untraceable. The true climax wasn't the death of Kale, but the shockwave it sent through Valerius. The general, who had lived his life by rules and brute force, stood on the muddy field, watching the smoke, and finally understood. He hadn't fought a band of rebels. He had fought a perfect calculation. Kale's last stand wasn't a desperate act. It was a strategically perfect, controlled demolition of the battlefield and the enemy's spirit. Valerius realized that he had wasted 5 days defeating a few hundred men, while the true prize, the people and the knowledge, had slipped away entirely. That realization was the Chosen One's perfect, final, and crushing victory. So, why did Kale's last stand become a required course at West Point, or whatever the modern equivalent is? It's not because they loved the hero. It's because they loved the strategy. Kale didn't teach them how to win against impossible odds. He taught them how to control defeat. The 4 lessons taken from the crossing of Varys are drilled into new cadets. Lesson 1. The tactical lie. Make your defense look easier than it is. Create false weaknesses, the broken walls, to lure the enemy into a situation where their predictable strengths, mass formation, become a debilitating weakness, the rubble maze. Lesson 2. Energy conservation is victory. Don't fight to kill. Fight to delay. Never use a full reserve when a half reserve will do. Rotate men not to rest them, but to confuse the enemy's intelligence gathering. Lesson 3. The morale attack. Your final act must not be messy. It must be controlled, symbolic, and utterly definitive. Use your death to break the enemy's will to fight your memory, not just your body. Kale's fire was a perfect psychological weapon. Lesson 4. Time is the only prize. When you came to battle, win the clock. Every hour gained is a resource stolen from the enemy and given to your people. Kale's flawless execution bought 48 hours, and his final, dramatic act bought 3 more days of safety. The story of the Chosen One, at Vari's Crossing, isn't about magic or prophecy. It's about a man who took the only advantage he had, his knowledge of how he was going to die, and turned into the most perfectly executed defensive operation in history. He didn't survive, but his plan did, and that, in the world of war, is the ultimate win. Watch the next video to learn the secret tactical advantage of the other legendary Chosen One.